You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 142, Ezekiel, chapters 26 and 27. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's a scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, how you doing this week?
Pretty good, Trey. We've had a real nice development as far as Miklat is going on. For listeners, again, if you don't subscribe to the newsletter, people who do would have gotten this news already, but you may know that one of the things we're doing, and the podcast helps that because people who listen to the podcast will donate to my nonprofit, Miklat. Our big project for this year was to get Supernatural, the short version of my book, The Unseen Realm. This is a much smaller book, but to get that book translated into as many languages as we can this year, and it's we're paying for people to do this. We've had our first translation actually completed, and we're barely into 2017. So the Chinese translation of Supernatural now exists. We're having it proofread, and eventually it'll go online for free. We're trying to strategize with some people in the Chinese church community. I guess I'll just leave it at that, so that they can sort of give us advice on, okay, what's the best way to get this to as many Chinese readers on their phones, on their computers, hard copy, whatever it is. How do we get this to as many people who read Chinese as possible? So that's the next step. But we actually have one down, and 6 or 7 others running. So that's pretty neat.
Yeah, that's exciting. That's awesome. Good.
Yep. So we're trucking along, and again, listeners, this is listener supported. Basically, the content I produce, whether it's on the website or here, really is made possible by people donating. And this is the kind of thing we want to do. We want to produce content that people can use for free. And in this case, that means people who don't read English, but in lots of other languages, especially those readers are persecuted church situation, under, all sorts of, obstacles, to getting Christian content. We're just hoping that what we produce here is going to get pirated and distributed as widely as possible. So, thanks for that.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. And we appreciate everybody that's contributed because it was made possible by you, the listeners. So,
yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Absolutely.
All right, Mike.
Well, we're going to do.
Yep. I'm ready for Ezekiel.
Might as well. Yeah, we'll jump in here. I mean, we got, we actually have 3 chapters, 26, 27, and 28, that are directed to the same nation. Again, these are the oracles against the nations, and we overviewed what the oracles against the nations are in the previous episode. But these 3 chapters are all directed against Tyre, and really sort of the money chapter is chapter 28. Again, this is the chapter, if you've read Unseen Realm, when we were going to devote a whole episode to chapter 28 because I want to take readers into, well, why do so many commentators want to deny that Ezekiel 28 has anything to do with Genesis 3 and the rebellion of the Nachash, again, the serpent, and they'll say it doesn't have anything to do with Isaiah 14, the rebellion of Hillel ben Shakar. Again, in Latin, that was Lucifer. That's how that gets translated, Lucifer, son of the dawn, the shining one. A lot of scholars want to divorce Ezekiel 28 from that stuff, even though, as I've argued in Unseen Realm, there are lots of good parallels. We're going to devote a whole episode to that chapter next time. For this chapter, though, we got to start with the previous 2 chapters 26 and 27. So, in some respect, this is sort of lead up again to chapter 28, to the so-called money chapter. But I don't want to lump all 3 of them because there's just a lot to talk about when we get to chapter 28. So as far as 26 and 27, prophecy against Tyre, chapter 26 is really sort of the primary oracle. Again, the prophetic utterance against Tyre, announcing the fact that Tyre is going to be judged by God. Chapter 27 is actually a lament over the fall of Tyre. And that doesn't mean that God punishes them in 26 and then God's sorry in 27. The lament is really focused on the surrounding peoples that are affected by what happens to Tyre. And of course, Tyre itself and that sort of thing. And by the way, Tyre, for those of you listening, it's Tyre. In case the term's unfamiliar, you're not actually looking at the text. This was a place geographically just to the north of where ancient Israel would have been, and even, of course, modern Israel. It's to the northern parts, the northern regions. In the ancient world, this would have been Phoenician territory. But I want to say a little bit about Tyre, because part of the impact of the fact that Tyre is going to be judged in chapter 26, it's hard to understand why that was a big deal for us. I mean, we don't have that context. For the ancient person to suggest that Tyre could fall would have been like, oh, come on, you got to be kidding. That's just never going to happen. And there are reasons for that we want to talk about in this episode, because I think that'll help a little bit sort of capture the magnitude, what that would have meant for people in the ancient world to see a city like this be conquered. Now, Bloch, we'll just start with him to sort of, again, set up the context, and then we'll go into to another source here. But Bloch writes this: all the oracles in chapter 25 had been hypothetically addressed toward the nation states on Judah's eastern, southern, and southwestern doorsteps. Remember this is me now interjecting here. Remember the last episode we talked about how they sort of proceed in this clockwise fashion around Judah. Back to Bloch. He says, along with Israel and Judah, Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia represented nation states, entities whose ethnic boundaries tended to be coterminous with their geopolitical borders. That is, the name of the state derived from the name of the people inhabiting the territory. But Tyre, and later in Ezekiel we're going to read about Sidon, Sidon. Tyre and later Sidon was different. This was a territorial state, according to which a single ethnic group was divided into a series of political units, each with its own capital city from which the state usually received its name, and its reigning monarch. The boundaries of the territorial states fluctuated depending on the strength and reach of a king. Like the Arameans, the Phoenicians, these are going to be Phoenician people here, the Phoenicians were divided into a series of territorial states. The ethnic composition of the Phoenician states provides a further contrast with their neighbors to the south, whereas the latter were all relative newcomers to the Jordan proper and the Transjordanian scene, having dispossessed the native inhabitants in the last half of the second millennium BC. The Phoenicians represented the remnants of the original population that occupied Canaan when the Israelites arrived. The name Tyre, in Hebrew it's Tzor, derives from the rock. Tzor is the Hebrew name for that. You can see how Tzor and Tzor are very similar. Tyre derives from the rock on which the city was built. In ancient times, the rock formed an island about 600 yards off the coast of Phoenicia, approximately 25 miles south of Sidon and 28 miles north of Akko. Ezekiel's recognition of this insular state is reflected in his location of Tyre as Belev or Betok Yamim, in the heart or in the midst of the sea. So Tyre was actually not on the mainland. The city was off the coast. Again, Bloch says about 600 yards off the coast on this huge rock. Now, Tyre is probably most known, if it's known at all, because of this situation, because of the military advantage to having your major city not on the mainland, but just sort of right out there in the middle of the water, should be kind of obvious. I mean, it would have been very, very difficult to assault the city because of what it was. Okay. Now, the Phoenicians were seafaring people. They had a very, very good navy. They could protect the city. And you couldn't have an invading army, just sort of walk up to the door or roll up siege ramps, because you got a 600-yard distance between where you're standing and where you want to be. So Tyre had this reputation for being kind of impregnable. That changes with Alexander the Great. And this is Again, if you've heard of Tyre, it might be because of this story, this whole episode. Tyre, again, is probably most familiar because of what Alexander does to take the city. In 332 BC, Alexander finally, after lots of people had tried, finally conquered Tyre by building, get this, he built a walkway of stone connecting the island to the mainland by means of an underwater causeway. There was a ridge of land that reached out to the island, but the land that was submerged by a good number of feet. It wasn't a huge depth, but it was. You couldn't take horses, through it. I mean, you couldn't do that. But what Alexander decides to do is to dump a lot of stone in and around that little part of land under the water, and he built essentially a road. He built a causeway, the distance from the mainland to Tyre to take the city. Now, it still wasn't easy. I'm going to read a little bit of a section here from Wikipedia. It has a nice little description of what went into this, and I'll read some excerpts. As Alexander could not attack the city from the sea, he built a kilometer-long causeway stretching out to the island on a natural land bridge about 2 meters deep. This causeway allowed his artillery to get in range of the walls. I mean, you could walk some people out there once you had it built. And in fact, it is still there to this day, as it was made of stone. As the work came near the walls, however, the water became much deeper, and the combined attacks from the walls and the Tyrian navy, again, the Tyre, the Phoenicians, they have a navy here, made construction nearly impossible. Therefore, Alexander constructed 2 towers that were approximately 160 feet high and moved them to the end of the causeway. And these were mobile towers. Like if you've ever seen siege warfare, you kind of get the idea. Moved them to the end of the causeway, and like most of Alexander's siege towers, these were, again, artillery platforms that were mobile. They had catapults on the top to clear defenders off the walls. They had ballista below to hurl rocks at the wall and attacking ships. The towers were made of wood, but they were covered in rawhide to protect them from fire arrows. Although these towers were possibly the largest of their kind ever made, the Tyrians, the people of Tyre, quickly devised a counterattack. They used an old horse transport ship, filled it with dried branches, pitch, sulfur, and various other combustibles. They sent it out there. They hung cauldrons of oil from the masts so that they would fall onto the deck once the masts burned through. They also weighed down the back of the ship so that the front rose above the water, again, so that the Greeks couldn't easily destroy, the other stuff that was sort of planned as offensive weaponry against them. So the front rose above the water. Then they lit it on fire and ran it into the causeway. Okay, the fire spread quickly because of all the combustibles on it, engulfing both towers and other siege equipment that had been brought up. The Tyrian ships swarmed the pier, destroying any siege equipment that hadn't caught fire, driving the Macedonian, the Greek crews away. Okay, so this doesn't quite work. It doesn't finish the job. After this, Alexander was convinced that he would not be able to take Tyre without a navy. Fortunately for him, his previous victory at Issus and subsequent conquests of the Phoenician city-states of Byblos, Arwad, and Sidon had caused the fleets of these cities, which composed most of the Persian navy, to come flocking to his banner. So he goes out, he conquers other places, and then he gets the navy. That's how he's going to finish the job here. This immediately gave him a command of 80 ships. This coincided also with the arrival of another 120 war galleys sent by the king of Cyprus, who had heard of his victories and wished to join him. With the arrival of another 23 ships from the Greek city-states of Ionia, Alexander all of a sudden had 223 galleys under his command, giving him command of the sea. Now, eventually this is going to work. They're going to succeed in getting the rest of the causeway to the city so that troops can go there. They're going to use the navy for that. Alexander's new navy is going to defeat the Tyrians, and eventually they're going to take Tyre. So Wikipedia adds those citizens that took shelter in the temple of Melkart inside the city were pardoned by Alexander, including the king of Tyre. According to Quintus Curtius Rufus, 6,000 fighting men were killed within the city, and 2,000 Tyrians were crucified on the beach. The others, some 30,000 people, were sold into slavery. The severity of reprisals was both because of the length of the siege and because the Tyrians had executed some captured soldiers on the walls in the sight of the attackers. That's the end of the Wikipedia quote. In short, Alexander got ticked off by that. And again, he, not wishing to offend, the deity of the city, if you took refuge in the temple, he spared you. But if you didn't, well, you're either going to be dead or sold into slavery. So this is a very famous account because it's so unusual. It took so long. It's Alexander. This is what Tyre is sort of known for in ancient history. This postdates, what we're going to be reading about in terms of what goes on in Ezekiel. But typically that's what people know about the place. It was considered impregnable. And not only that, but as we get into the content of the message here, Tyre was an extremely wealthy city. There's a reason why the king of Cyprus would want to help Alexander. Sure, he wants to be Alexander's buddy, but as well, this is a way to eliminate the place that economically controlled the region, and basically substitute yourself, move yourself in there to take care of your competition. So Tyre was extraordinarily wealthy, the center of trade for the area, and it was considered impregnable. So in Ezekiel 26, everybody, it has this reputation by this time, and it's going to have it for centuries. And Ezekiel more or less says, well, that's nice, but you're going to lose your independence anyway. And what Ezekiel actually prophesies as far as Tyre's judgment is, yes, you're going to be in trouble, just like all the other oracles against the nations here. And that's not going to, your reputation isn't going to save you. You're still going to be dealt with. And the historic outcome of what Ezekiel says in this chapter isn't the loss of the city, because it was never, conquered physically like this until Alexander's time, but it did lose its independence. It does get taken over, put under tribute, and controlled by foreign powers, and winds up being economically a has-been until it can build itself back up a little bit, and then of course Alexander takes care of business later on. So as far as the actual chapter, let's just jump in here. We're not going to read all 2 chapters, but we're just going to skip around here. The first 6 verses are going to sound familiar if you listened to last week's episode. In the 11th year, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, because Tyre said concerning Jerusalem, aha, the gate of the peoples is broken, it has swung open to me. I shall be replenished now that she is laid waste. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, O Tyre, and will bring up many nations against you, as the sea brings up its waves. They shall destroy the walls of Tyre, break down her towers. I'll scrape her soil from her, make her a bare rock. Now, those are the first 4 verses. Eventually, that's what's going to happen. It's going to take a while to get there, but you're going to have in near time to what Ezekiel is saying, Tyre is going to lose its independence. Eventually, Alexander's going to wipe it off, the rock, so to speak. So we're going to get there, but this sort of introduces what's going to follow as a long history of troubles for Tyre, and it's going to be cast as this is the judgment of God on you. And why? Why? What's her crime? If you remember from last episode, this gloating over the fact that Jerusalem is destroyed, this, the thrill, this exclamation that Yahweh's people is no more. Yahweh has been stripped of his inheritance, or he surrendered his inheritance. Now, this place is like all the other nations. Okay, the Most High has given up again, which means, of course, that the Most High's plan is lost. Okay, because you gloated over this set of circumstances, I am against you. In other words, as I said last time, a number of times in that episode, the story does not end here. And Tyre's going to find that out, just like the other nations in chapter 25. found out as well. So the gloating is specifically mentioned again. And again, it's this theme of hubris, this theme of Yahweh's the loser. His plan didn't work. He has to disinherit them like he disinherited us. And this is good news because now he is without an inheritance. Back to the Deuteronomy 32:8-9 worldview. So this is what sort of incenses God or becomes in the text the reason for what's going to happen. Now, when we get past that point, we get typically, like we saw last time, you get descriptions of the kind of things that are going to happen. Verse 7, thus says the Lord God, behold, I will bring against Tyre from the north Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with the horses and chariots and horsemen and host of soldiers. He'll kill with a sword your daughters on the mainland. He will set up a siege wall against you and throw up a mound against you and raise a roof of shields against you. He'll direct the shock of his battering rams against your walls. With his axes he will break down your towers. You get this long description of battle that ultimately is just going to end badly for Tyre. Now the description here, Taylor notes, I just want to read a little section here before I make a few comments here. Taylor writes this: the description of the siege comes oddly in connection with an island stronghold like Tyre, where horses would certainly not be deployed. Perhaps Ezekiel was using conventional forms without regard to reality, but it is better to understand this as the description of a land-based siege, as was adopted by the Assyrians when they besieged Tyre earlier in 673 and 668 BC. When Alexander the Great took Tyre, it was after a similar siege operations following on the building of an enormous, causeway from the mainland to the island, again, that we just read about. So apparently, Taylor says that, what Ezekiel knows of battle, he's drawing on what he knows of battle, siege warfare, and that's why you get the description. The Assyrians did use this, but in their case, of course, they didn't destroy the city. Typically what happens with Tyre, it happened with the Assyrians, it's also going to happen with the Babylonians, is that they take enough of a beating where they solicit their enemy and say, look, it's going to take you forever to take this place because, hey, look, you got 600 yards of water between you and it and us, but we don't want to sit here and be under siege. We don't want to do this. So we will pay you money and be under your tribute, and let's just call it good. And that's typically what happened with Tyre. They would submit to treaty, not really treaty, but tribute. It's sort of a treaty, but essentially, again, paying off their aggressors, their enemies, to end the siege. And again, historically speaking, that's what's going to happen here with Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the effect of this, though, it could be sort of so-so, not so bad, or it could be terrible. It could be awful. And from this point forward, it's really going to be something that amounts to the beginning of the end for the city. Because the Babylonians and those who, follow in the wake until you get to the time of Alexander when, again, he just finishes the job, they're not going to be content with just, okay, pay me a lump sum and then we'll call it good. Tyre is going to start losing its commerce. It's going to be usurped by not only Babylon, but other nations in the area that are in league with Babylon. Babylon allows them and enforces the idea of cutting off Tyre economically from some of the things that the city had a monopoly on. That the reason why they got so wealthy. So it's really going to be the beginning of the end for them. And eventually, the city is going to lose its independence and fall. It's going to be very ordinary, and you get that feeling when you read through the chapter. I'm going to go down to verse 15. It says, thus says the Lord God to Tyre, will not the coastland shake at the sound of your fall, when the wounded groan when slaughter is made in your midst? Then all the princes of the sea will step down from their thrones and remove their robes and strip off their embroidered garments. They will clothe themselves with trembling. They will sit on the ground and tremble every moment and be appalled at you. And they will raise a lamentation over you and say to you, how you have perished, you who were inhabited from the seas. O city renowned, who was mighty on the sea, she and her inhabitants imposed their terror on all her inhabitants. Now the coastlands tremble on the day of your fall, and the coastlands that are on the sea are dismayed at your passing. Why should they worry? Why should they care? Well, because their economic livelihood depended on Tyre in many respects. The region is now going to be controlled by somebody else. Yeah, Tyre's still there. It's still a functioning city. There's still people living in it, again, but it's not the same place. Everybody that was tied to her fate, her destiny, her wealth, her livelihood, if she was doing well, we do well. If that all changes. And so this is a big deal. This is a big deal in the whole region. Verse 20, you actually get, even darker language. Thus says the Lord God, this verse 19, we'll go there, when I make you a city laid waste like the cities that are not inhabited, when I bring up the deep over you and the great waters cover you, then I will make you go down with those who go down to the pit, to the people of old, and I will make you dwell in the world below, among ruins from of old, with those who go down to the pit, so that you will not be inhabited, but I will set beauty in the land of the living. That's verses 19 through 20. Now, again, this refers to an even darker future. You probably recognize it. The writer is using the language of the underworld to describe what is ultimately going to happen to Tyre. I'll make you go down with those who go down to the pit. I will make you to dwell in the world. The word there is eretz, and which is sometimes, if you've read Unseen Realm, you know that eretz can be a term used not just of the earth and the land, but also the underworld, where the dead live. I will make you to dwell in the eretz below, among the ruins from of old, and those who go down to the pit, so on and so forth. So Taylor writes, in highly figurative language, the island city of Tyre is pictured as submerged beneath the waves of the sea. Again, this is a poetic description. The island didn't actually sink. And it's fitting because, again, the waves represent chaos. If you're a victim of chaos, you go underneath the waves. Again, Sheol, the place of the dead, the abyss, was a watery place in Israelite cosmology. Okay, so the portrayal fits. Taylor writes, these become the waves of the mythological cosmic flood, the waters of chaos, which have engulfed her at last. Similar language is used of Egypt in chapter 31, Ezekiel 31, verses 14 through 18, Ezekiel 32. We'll get to these passages. It's also used of Isaiah's taunt song over the king of Babylon in Isaiah 14. Okay, this language about being in Sheol. The passage gives the impression that the pit, which is identical with Sheol, is the place of no return and of utter lostness. There is no hope of resurrection, simply a murky, continuing existence alongside the people of old among the ruins of the past, unquote. That's the end of Taylor's quote. Again, the underworld was, we don't use words like that. We use afterlife. Okay, this is how you have to think about it. The realm of the dead was a place where there's still people. Okay, they're the people of old. They're the ones who've been there a long time, because this is where all the dead go, and they have this cadaverous existence. And Tyre, again, that language is used here of Tyre, basically saying, this is your destiny. This is what's going to befall you. There is no resurrection from this place. It's permanent. This is why, again, the hope of the righteous in the Old Testament was to be extracted from Sheol, to be taken to be with the Lord. You don't have the kind of precise language that you get in the New Testament for, the heavenly afterlife or the hellish afterlife or something like that. It's a very negative place. It's the place where the Rephaim dead live, again, who are regarded as, again, these demonic spirits, again, bad guys. You don't want to stay there. You want to be with the Lord. And this is your hope. The hope of getting out. And it's only because the only way you can get out, the only way you can escape death is for the Most High God to remove you from that situation, that place, and transplant you to someplace else where He is. Again, this is it's Old Testament afterlife talk, but it's very familiar to us too. And the fact that Tyre is described in this way, look, Tyre is not the people of God. There is no resurrection for Tyre, for the people, the people of Tyre. When this happens to you, it's going to be permanent. You are going to be separated from anything positive forever. This is your destiny. So it's a pretty dark, description of ultimately what's going to go on here. We've got sort of an immediate set of circumstances going on, with the whole loss of economical livelihood, both her and everybody else around her that's connected to her. Everybody's affected by this. No one thought that, again, by the time Alexander gets there, really does wipe the rock clean, that the place was impregnable. This couldn't happen. Again, the messaging is fairly clear. If it can happen to Tyre, it can happen anywhere. It can happen to you. Tyre is not going to be an exception. Tyre offended Yahweh, the God of Israel, by gloating over the fact that Yahweh's presence departed from the land of his inheritance, and his people were driven away from their inheritance from him. They gloated, and they're going to be punished, because the same thing awaits them, and even worse, because whereas God will, in the book of Ezekiel especially, whereas God will raise up Israel. Remember the dry bones chapter? Again, we haven't gotten to that yet, but it's very familiar. That resurrective imagery there. As God's going to do that with his people, but he ain't going to do it with you. You're going to be in the pit. You're going to be in the abyss with all the critters down there. Again, the people of old, that sort of thing. It's not where you want to be. So that's where the story will end, not here. At chapter 27, we get a lament of Tyre. And again, this isn't God saying, oh boy, I wish I hadn't done that. So it's not like God lamenting, over what happened. Let's just jump into the chapter. You'll get the feel for it. 27 verse 1, the word of the Lord came to me. Now you, son of man, raise up a lamentation over Tyre, and say to Tyre, who dwells at the entrances to the sea, merchant of the peoples, to many coastlands. Thus says the Lord God, O Tyre, you have said, I am perfect in beauty. Your borders are in the heart of the seas. Your builders made perfect your beauty. They made all your planks of fir trees from Sinir. They took a cedar from Lebanon to make a mast for you. Of oaks of Bashan they made your oars. They made your deck of pines. From the coasts of Cyprus, inlaid with ivory, of fine embroidered linen from Egypt was your sail, serving as your banner. Blue and purple from the coasts of Elisha was your awning. The inhabitants of Sidon and Arvad were your rowers. Your skilled men, O Tyre, were in you. They were your pilots. The elders of Gival and her skilled men were in you, caulking your seams. All the ships of the sea with their mariners were in you to barter for your wares. This first 9 verses will stop there. I mean, in essence, what you have here in this lament, Son of Man, raise up a lament for Tyre, is you have a poem. There's this. If you look, you're looking at it in a modern English translation anyway. This is going to be put in poetic stanzas. What I just read. You have a poem that casts Tyre as a ship, which is kind of fitting. Again, they were a seafaring people, sort of the good ship Tyre. It's cast as a ship, and it's fitted out with all the best stuff. It's expertly built. It's expertly crafted. It's expertly crewed. It's built from the best materials, by the leading craftsmen of the day, all that stuff. And it's not an exaggeration where in verse 3, God says, you've said, O Tyre, you have said, I am perfect in beauty. Well, yeah, that was kind of true. There wasn't anything like her, nothing like her. Verses 10 and 11, the prophet adds, Persia and Lud and Put were in your army as men of war. They had mercenaries. Syrians had mercenaries fighting for them. In verses 12 through 25, I'm not going to read the whole thing, just give you a sampling here. You get a list of all of the cities, the places that traded with Tyre. By the way, if you're reading a King James here, there's going to be lots of disconnects between modern translations of this section, this whole chapter really, and the King James, because there are a lot of textual problems in this passage that are only going to get sorted out through modern text discoveries like Qumran and whatnot, and that's sort of a sidebar. So in verse 12, Tarshish did business with you because of the great wealth of every kind. Silver, iron, tin, lead they exchanged for your wares. Javan, Tubal, and Meshech traded with you. They exchanged human beings. They were slave traders. And vessels of bronze for your merchandise. From Beth Togarmah they exchanged horses and war horses and mules. The men of Dedan traded with you. Many coastlands were on your special markets. They brought you payment in ivory tusks and ebony. You go through the list. There's just a whole grocery list of things that get traded with Tyre and places that are doing it. This is New York City. This is the commercial capital of the region. The good ship Tyre is the place where it all happens. This is where the world trades. Okay, they're the seafaring. They're the top of the heap here, and they benefit from it immensely. Now, a couple of things to observe here. Again, I'm not going to read through the whole chapter because it's basically just more of this. Tyre's wonderful. Look at all the trade that she did. And then in verses 25 through 36, Tyre gets shipwrecked. Because, again, it's an analogy to the destruction that we read about in chapter 26. But I just want to actually make a few other kind of observations, things that we can get from this chapter, because on its own, again, this is sort of window dressing leading up to chapter 28, which is what we really want to focus on with Tyre as far as the king and the backdrop of divine rebellion and the whole Genesis 3 serpent question and all that. We have to wait for next time to do that. But as far as this, I just want to point out a few things that I think are interesting that I think the listeners might think are interesting. First of all, if you read through this chapter, and I've given you enough of it to give you the feel for it, all of these locations, these places that Tyre is trading with, all of these locations need to be, this is going to sound like I'm pointing out the obvious, but it actually does need to be pointed out. All these locations need to be accessible by means of the sea and waterways leading to the sea. That is, they all need to be situated in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Black Sea area, the Aegean Sea right there. You say, big deal. Who cares? Well, did you catch some of the place names that we read? Tubal, Meshech, Beth Togarmah. Folks, contrary to what you may have heard or read in some popular prophecy book, these places are not Russia. Now, when we get to Ezekiel 38 and 39, we're going to look at other reasons why the prince of Rosh, Tubal, Meshech, Togarmah, okay, it's not Russia, and these aren't cities in Russia, in Russian territory. That is utterly bogus. It is utterly without merit. There are textual reasons in Ezekiel 38 to conclude that, but here, think about it. We're talking about Tyre. Okay, Russia, Moscow is not Meshech. Moscow is over 800 miles from the Black Sea, and it's not connected by a waterway. Okay, what you need in this passage is these places need to be sea accessible by ship. This is trading. This is maritime trading. You got to be right there on the sea at a port, or you've got to have some waterway, that you can, get to the sea. Now, sure, you could say, well, land traders, could bring their goods to the ports and all that. Yeah, they could. Almost 900 miles. Okay. And even if you say they made the trip from Meshech, Moscow, okay, to a port, the port still isn't Meshech. Okay, this is not Russian territory. It violates biblical geography, not to mention common sense, to say that. But you'll have prophecy experts, go to Ezekiel 38 and 39, probably never even look at, Ezekiel 27. That's a boring chapter. They'll go up there and talk about the Prince of Rosh and Russia and Meshech and Moscow and all this stuff. It's nonsense. Okay, you basically just have to ignore biblical geography to do this kind of stuff. Now, Block has, I think, a nice summary in his commentary of some of these, and so I'm going to pick out some of the more interesting ones and just read what he says to you. Javan, or Yavan, Javan, is the standard Old Testament designation for the Greek world. It's related etymologically to Ionians. Again, that's Asia Minor, Aegean area. Okay. Tubal or Tabal was the territorial designation of the interior Anatolian kingdom, and that's Asia Minor, Turkey, Aegean Sea, to the west there, the Mediterranean to the south, okay? Territorial designation of the interior Anatolian kingdom known to the Assyrians as Beit Boritash. This landlocked kingdom between the Halius River, waterway, and the Taurus River, waterway, in Asia Minor was bounded on the west by Meshech, on the south by Hilaku, on the east by Melidu and Til Garimu, which is Beth Togarma, on the north by Kasku. I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but here's the point. Scholars know where these cities are. They know where they were, they know where they are. These terms show up in ancient texts, whether they're Assyrian text, Hittite text, that would be one of the languages of Anatolia. Okay, these are not mysteries. This is not Russia. So we either throw all of the ancient Near Eastern evidence to the wind, or we just ignore it, or I think more likely we're just ignorant of it, and we just throw biblical geography out the window, or we don't. Okay, we're either going to interpret the Bible in its own context, or we're not. It's real simple. Again, this Russia nonsense, frankly, we need to stop the madness. I don't know any other way to say it. Just stop the madness. Quit. Using the Cold War as your hermeneutic. For understanding this passage and passages like Ezekiel 38 and 39. Back to block here. Meshech is to be identified with Mushku in Neo-Assyrian sources. Again, it's no mystery. It was located in central Anatolia. Beth Togarma, Genesis 10:3 identifies Togarma along with Ashkenaz and Riphath as the son of Gomer, the nephew of Javan, Meshech, and Tubal. Again, associated with all those other geographical names. Most scholars equate the name with the capital of Kamanu, or Kumani, known in Hittite text as Tegarama, and in Akkadian as Til-Garimu, and in classical sources as Garina, modern Gorun, which is a district of Turkey, ancient Anatolia. Again, we are not talking about Russia. Now the point, again, is if you didn't get it already, the Russia nonsense is not just about misreading words in Ezekiel 38 and 39, which we'll get to. It also involves violating biblical geography and throwing all the ancient Near Eastern comparative material just out the window. So if that's what you want to do, be warmed and filled, but that's not responsible biblical interpretation. The second thought I want to sort of just leave you with as we wrap up here is what was the actual outcome historically, closer to Ezekiel's day, as opposed to, what we read, earlier, back in chapter 26 about Tyre and Alexander and all that. Anchor Bible Dictionary, I think, has a good summary here of kind of the way this winds up. Mercenaries served the Tyrian Empire, but there is never any mention of a military campaign on the mainland in which Tyre was involved. The Tyrians knew how to defend their island stubbornly, as seen from the annals of the Assyrian kings, and also from Tyrian records, which Josephus alludes to. But they always preferred, if possible, to pay tribute, which was redistributed to Tyre's customers. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar's victory over Pharaoh Necho in 605 BC changed the political map of Western Asia, and that's actually mentioned in 2 Kings 24:7. From that time until the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus in 539 BC, Tyre was the main foe of Babylon in Asia. While there were contacts between Tyre and Judah, Jeremiah 27, verse 3 is an example, and between Tyre and the Philistine city-states, Tyre was jubilant when Jerusalem fell in 586 BC. The Tyrian king did not, however, recognize the immediate danger. Only too late did Tyre recognize the political and strategic line of Nebuchadnezzar, who, after the fall of Jerusalem, turned to Tyre and besieged it to safeguard his lines, his trade lines, his own trade, for his ultimate goal, the conquest of Egypt. He's basically going to use them. He's going to use their navy. He's going to use their wealth to turn and conquer Egypt. Continuing with Anchor Bible Dictionary, Josephus quotes the Phoenician or the Tyrian archives and also Philostratus's history. This is in Antiquities, Josephus Antiquities 10, 228. which record that Nebuchadnezzar besieged Tyre for 13 years. The siege is mentioned by Ezekiel in chapter 29, who says that Nebuchadnezzar will carry off much booty from Egypt as a recompense for his failure in Tyre. Again, he never destroys it. Apparently, the long siege ended with a treaty. The royal Tyrian house had to reside in Babylon. So they're losing their independence here, like we've mentioned earlier. The Tyrian house, the royal house, had to reside in Babylon. Although a Tyrian king could rule in Tyre, next to him a Babylonian commissioner was appointed with a seat in Ushu. In contrast to other royal families living in Babylon, the Tyrians could always fetch the heir apparent from Babylon. They were extended that privilege. Yet Tyre's power had been totally exhausted. Its overseas territories were taken over by Carthage, with the exception of Tyrian possessions in Cyprus. Again, they lose their independence permanently. Their wealth is in decline, and eventually, again, they become ordinary players. And they are owned. Okay, if we can use that modern expression, they are owned by Babylon. And they never really recover from this financially. Again, the city was still there. They weren't totally destroyed. The rock isn't wiped clean. That's going to happen with Alexander. But they are never the same. And that's the point of what Ezekiel is saying here. You say in your heart, I'm perfect in beauty. I'm this, I'm that, and the other thing. Well, yeah, you are. But that's going to come to an end. And this is the way it's going to happen. You gloated when Nebuchadnezzar, came in there, did what he did to Jerusalem. But guess what? Newsflash. The same guy is going to do this to you. And you're not going to be what you have always been. And that was how the story, ends. Now, again, all this is backdrop really to chapter 28, because then we're really going to get into the how Ezekiel uses the story of a divine rebel who's just the ultimate example of hubris and splendor and power, okay, and wonderfulness, and how that divine being rebels, transgresses Yahweh and is brought down. And again, if you've read Unseen Realm, you know where we're going with that thought. But next time we'll hit chapter 28, and I'm going to take the time to go through a lot that's in the chapter and talk about why a lot of translations and a lot of other scholars take a different view than me. There are reasons why they do that. They're not really very good reasons, but they're understandable reasons. So we're going to devote a lot of our attention to that next time. So if you're looking for Ezekiel 28 and Eden and the cherub, the anointed cherub and all that, okay, not this time, but next.
All right, Mike, that's a good build-up for next week. So I'm already ready for that.
I like to read, stuff like, the Alexander conquest, because they just didn't give up. I mean, they just sometimes did. It's kind of like Masada, where the Romans used the Jewish slaves to build the ramp up to the top of Masada, and knowing that the Jews wouldn't shoot their own, and they could be brutal, clever. They did crazy things to win.
Well, all right. Next week, Mike.
Yep. Next week, back into Eden a little bit through Ezekiel. We'll see how that goes.
All right. We just want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.